All right, let's get right into it. Brazil is just massive, right? A country on a continental scale. But trying to get something from point A to point B here, it can seriously feel like you're trying to solve a giant, complicated labyrinth. So, today, we're going to break down the walls of that maze. We're going to figure out exactly why Brazil's logistics are so famously expensive and, frankly, inefficient. So, our journey starts with a concept that pretty much every business in the country knows all too well: the coastal Brazil, or the Brazil cost. It's this catch all term for all the systemic problems that make operating here such a challenge. And you know what? Logistics is probably the biggest, most expensive part of that puzzle. You've probably asked yourself this: why is everything so expensive? From the food you eat to the phone in your hand, a huge piece of that final price tag comes from the crazy, costly journey those things take just to get to you. But just how big of a piece are we talking about? Yeah, you heard that right. 13%. That's the number. According to some really deep analysis, logistics costs eat up a staggering 13% of Brazil's entire gross domestic product. I mean, that is a massive, massive drain on the whole economy. And to really put that in perspective, well, just look at this comparison with a mature economy like the United States. The difference is pretty stark, isn't it? The US spends around 8% of its GDP on logistics. That 5-point gap between them and Brazil, that represents billions and billions of dollars in lost competitiveness, higher prices for everyone, and just wasted resources. So where is all this costs coming from? Well, the first and maybe the most obvious wall in our labyrinth is the road itself. See, Brazil made a huge bet on highways a long time ago, and today it's really paying the price for relying so heavily on them. And this chart just lays it all out there. The imbalance is insane. Over 60% of all cargo in Brazil moves on trucks. For a country this enormous, that's just really unusual. Other huge countries like China or Russia, they rely way more on cheaper, long-distance options, like railways and waterways. And this wasn't some accident. It was a very deliberate policy choice way back in the 1950s under Presidents Juscelino Kubitschek. The big idea was to integrate the country and bring in the auto industry. But what it created is what economists call path dependency. It's like once you start down one road, it's really hard to turn back. It locked the country into this future of expensive diesel-burning transport and just left the old rail network to basically fall apart. And that has very real consequences right now. The National Transport Confederation says that over half of Brazil's paved roads are in bad shape. And that's not just annoying, it's expensive. Bad pavement can jack up vehicle maintenance costs by up to 35%. And that cost, it doesn't just disappear. It gets paid by the trucker, then the producer, and at the end of the day, by you. But here's the thing. The physical roads, they're only part of the story. The parts of the labyrinth that will truly drive you crazy are the walls you can't see. We're talking about a tangled web of taxes, bureaucracy, and systemic risks that make every single shipment way more complicated than it needs to be. This quote from the analysis we're looking at just says it all, doesn't it? It perfectly captures how absurd the situation is. It means the smartest, most efficient route is often ignored just to get a better tax deal. Logic goes out the window. And here's a classic example of that. It's known as the Passeio do Cargo, or the cargo tour. Get this. A company in Sao Paulo needs to send something to a client right next door in Minas Gerais. But to get a tax break, they first ship the cargo hundreds of kilometers in the wrong direction, out to a facility in Espírito Santo, only to then ship it all the way back west to the final client. It's totally insane from a logistics point of view, but it makes financial sense.
Crazy.
And these invisible barriers don't stop on the roads. Oh no, they follow you right to the country's ports. Getting a container cleared isn't just about ships and cranes. It's a full-on battle against red tape. You've got the Federal Revenue Service, Anvisa for health, Vigio for agriculture, and like a dozen other agencies, each with its own process, and they often don't even have a shared digital system. It's a mess. And the data just spells it out. A container might just sit in a Brazilian port for 10, maybe 15 days just waiting to be cleared. Meanwhile, in hyper-efficient ports like Singapore or Rotterdam, that time is closer to 2 to 4 times days. And that's not just a delay, it's a massive cost that ripples down the entire supply chain. And there is one last invisible wall, one that's tragically common in Brazil: insecurity. the constant, looming threat of cargo theft has led to what you can only really call a militarization of logistics. Think about it. The need for armed escorts, fancy tracking systems, and huge insurance premiums can add a whopping 15% to the total cost of freight on some of these routes. That is a cost of doing business that just doesn't exist on this scale in most other developed countries. Okay, so we've walked through the dark, winding corridors of this labyrinth. It's pretty bleak. But the big question is, how does Brazil find its way out? Well, the good news is, there is a map. It's based on smart reforms and some very targeted investments. So the path forward really comes down to three big things. First, a serious tax reform to get rid of those ridiculous cargo tours. Second, real investment in a multimodal system. That means we're vitalizing railways and coastal shipping. And third, embracing all the new technology and innovation coming from Brazil's booming ecosystem of logistics startups or logtechs. This table here is basically the cheat sheet for everything we've talked about. It's a great summary. It links each big problem we've covered, from the dependency on trucks to the issue of insecurity, directly to its root cause and a potential solution. It really shows that while these problems are complex, they're not impossible to solve. Everything is connected, and it's going to take a coordinated effort. Wow, okay, we've covered a ton of ground mapping out this whole complex situation. And hey, if you found this breakdown interesting and you want to go deeper on topics just like this one, make sure you follow the Macroeconomia channel. We're always breaking down the key economic challenges and opportunities that are shaping Brazil and the rest of the world. And finally, just before we wrap up, a quick disclaimer and a little note on the sources we use for this explainer. So just so we're clear, all the information we talked about today is for educational purposes only and is based on an analysis called the labyrinth of efficiency. I think the key thing to take away is this. Brazil's high costs aren't just some number on a spreadsheet. They're a direct result of historical choices and these deep systemic hurdles. But with the right map, a mix of reform, investment, and technology, there is a clear path out of the labyrinth. Thanks for tuning in.